This episode of Fire Engineering Podcast is sponsored by LogRX, providing real-time accountability of all your narcotics from cradle to grave. Coming soon, LogRX will also track medical supplies, equipment, PPE, and even vehicle checks. Learn a better way to track your narcotics at logrx.com. That's LOGRX.com.
Like a trusted turnout jacket you've had for years, Flex 7 outer shell fabric delivers a perfectly broken-in feel on the very first wear. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of enforced technology, Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tencatafabrics.com/flex7. Flex 7, powered by enforced technology. Only from TenCate Protective Fabrics.
Taking it to the streets is all about advancing firefighter safety and operational integrity for the fire service through provocative insights and dynamic discussions dedicated to both the art and science of firefighting and the traditions of the fire service. The focus at Taking It to the Street continues to be straightforward, street-level talk with intelligent, stimulating, and provocative insights and dynamic discussion with interactive dialogue and, most importantly, listener participation. Just like around the kitchen table or in the day room over a cup of coffee at 02:30 after a good run. And now, the latest edition of Taking It to the Streets with your host, Christopher Naum. Welcome to this edition of Buildings on Fire's Taking It to the Streets. I'm your host, Christopher Naum, on your street, in your city, across the country, and around the world. Taking It to the Streets is a monthly radio talk show program on fireengineering.com, Blog Talk Radio. And again, as always, a heartfelt welcome to our dedicated and loyal program listeners and to our ever-expanding following of our newest live listeners and those that are downloading and listening to our program on their multimedia devices. Taking It to the Streets is all about advancing operational excellence and decisive engagement for the fire service through provocative insights and dynamic discussions focusing in on the built environment. Again, we've got another great program lined up for you here today on this episode of Buildings on Fire, Taking It to the Streets. As you should recall back, we started off our multi-part series talking about building construction as related to training. Our first two episodes, and this being our third and final installment on the series, laid out the framework and the building blocks, talking about, again, a number of different issues affecting the fire service, affecting our operations within the streets as it relates to structural firefighting. And the one most significant aspect that we have constantly resonated with here on our program is the importance of understanding the built environment. And it's safe to say again, and it goes without saying to say it again, the built environment is developing and growing faster and quicker with greater complexity and greater demands than our tactical models, as well as our experience levels are aligning to. And I think the important part that I put into that common discussion point is that our training is not aligning with the continuing momentum that building construction and the built environment is presenting in front of us. And that in itself is creating a continuing substantial gap as it relates to knowledge, skills, and abilities, the fundamentals of building construction that have always and traditionally have always been the foundation of our training. But I would, it's safe to say that we are continuing to see a significant gap that's affecting the fire service. And I think in most instances, we are not recognizing the significance of that gap as it relates to operations. For some of us in the streets that are operating at the company, at the command level, in a variety of positions, whether you are at the firefighter company officer or the first arriving command or incident command level, the one thing I think is striking when we take a look at the demands associated with today's fireground, especially over the last 20 years, I think that the benchmarking of the early 2000s, and here we are in 2024, We are seeing a continuing adversity, not only in terms of new construction, but also the impacts on legacy construction. And I use that term very, very liberally here, unfortunately. And I'm not a fan of that terminology, as many of you know, at all, because the term itself has really done a disservice for the fire service in terms of primarily associating everything that's old with this terminology, and that term in itself is limiting. It is as limiting as it possibly could be regarding the fact that we've now attached a term to a variety of era and vintage of both construction, methodologies, technologies, and so forth, of a variety of building types and occupancies and construction systems and methodologies that span centuries of time, going back certainly into the 1900s, the 1800s, and the 1700s. And yes, many of our jurisdictions, for many of our listeners that are out there, many of you again have some buildings, certainly here in the Northeast, when we talk about 1600s, that century of the mid to late 1600s, there are still numerous buildings in first due areas in a variety of metropolitan locations, especially in the East Coast, that have structures that were built in that era of time and still are being utilized in a variety of standpoint, with a whole variety of different risk factors that are associated with them. But nonetheless, we have, and although we're not going to delve into that, there are a number of episodes in our archives here on fire engineering that you can go back to. We had at least one specific program, and again, I think back either in 2023, possibly even in 22, we did a dedicated program talking about era and vintage as it relates to the adaptive fireground management model, talking about first arriving construction tactics and safety, our building facts model. It has everything to do with the continuing dialogue that this program strives to bring forward to the fire service and to our listeners to better understand the built environment, better understand how the built environment truly influences much of our, if not much, if not everything that has to do with our decision-making process on today's fireground, but certainly influences a variety of different factors and facets, especially when we talk about building predictability, fire travel, fire dynamics, how it's going to affect the integrity and life-saving sustainability of our potential civilians that are either in distress and or are entrapped within the structures. It deals with, again, the predictability of the building's performance under duress, under fire dynamics, under the variety of conditions that are imposing factors on that building that we have to operate within, around, on top, underneath, next to, that defines our operations. It can't get any simpler than that. When we talk about that building, that occupancy, the conditions that we have, that we're confronted with, whether they be a structural condition, an environmental condition, fire condition, and so forth, and there are civilians that are being impacted by those conditions. The building's construction anatomy, the building's construction systems, the time in which it was built, the era and vintage, the variety of life cycle issues that affect that building relative to when it was built, and what has changed over the years and decades and sometimes centuries of time. So they all have a impact. We've discussed that in other episodes. I would encourage you to take a look at our archives here on fire engineering and take a look at some of those other elements. If this is the first time you're visiting our program, again, welcome. But again, we have a lot of history behind our programs that lays out a lot of different aspects. And again, one of the things that we've strived to do is to try to build upon our programs so that it's not once and done, especially when we talk about building construction. Building construction has such a vast degree of technical relevancy, both from an architectural engineering, fire protection standpoint, historical context, coupled with the variety of factors that affect varying types of occupancies. It's not occupancy type, but occupancy risk, and those conditions that all manifest themselves when we talk about the operations in the streets. That's why when we discuss the importance of that first arriving, that building facts model that we continue to stress and make reference to in our programs, it's all about that first arriving, that tactical window, first arriving aspects that are reflected upon construction. So the acronym of first arriving, FACTS, FACTS, first arriving, construction, tactics, and safety. The construction influences the tactics have a varying level of safety or risk, and they all work collectively in a manner that, again, influences our decision-making, influences our tactical deployments, influences our strategic game plan, all of which fundamentally go back to our level of comprehension, our level of knowledge, our level of understanding, our ability to predict, our ability to not only to assess during the size-up standpoint, but also to be able to predict how that building will perform during the conduct of our operations, and sometimes in very, very critical stages when we talk about the tactical windows of operations. And again, that is also another episode that we talked about, our tactical windows on the fire ground and how they relate back to operations. So I'm going to get myself queued up here a little bit with some information in front of us. So again, in our previous programs, we've talked about, and again, as part of our series on training and how it relates back to the built environment, again, when we take a look at building construction is fundamental to structural firefighting as water is to fire suppression. That, again, is a major building block of our discussion point. If you're going to command and tactically engage in a structural fighter, you better understand the building, understand the built environment. There's limited margins for error on today's demanding fire ground and evolving fire ground, and errors and omissions may be very, very unforgiving from that standpoint. And lastly, again, stretching in and operating in a building that you have no knowledge of or comprehension of, or insights of, is derelict at best. And again, it places you and your companies certainly in a compromising condition and so forth. And certainly, one of the challenges out there is that because of and we mentioned this in our last program, much of the challenges associated with understanding and comprehending it, and more importantly, studying building construction, typically revolves around the highly technical basis that construction has. I think when we continue to see how it has been simplified, diluted, and watered down, almost to the point of being unrecognizable when we talk about the study of building construction, and especially when it's interjected and is referenced back to the types of training documents, whether it be within the professional studies areas with the firefighter series, the fire officer series. They are certainly small sound bites at best. But again, many of our firefighters, and especially officers and commanders, it's once and done. You finished off your credentialing or some level of training. You've gotten some exposure to some fundamentals of building construction that typically fall under the 5 fundamental types or classifications. We talk a little bit about occupants. We talk a little bit about some characteristics that are, again, fundamental to the performance of a building, but usually it's very limiting. It's scratching the surface. We never get further along in that. We bring into account some new emerging issues dealing with modern construction, which, again, as I mentioned a few moments ago, we have unfortunately compacted and associated it and binned building construction as it relates to modern construction and legacy construction. And again, it has been a disservice to categorize those in that manner, because when we take a look at the variety of variations associated with modern construction, as well as the variety of variations associated with legacy construction, which is everything other than modern construction, there are so many different layers that we continue to advocate and identify relative to our modeling that provides a wealth of insights if we can study them relative to some importance. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about in this episode, just taking a look at how era vintages and the association of when a building was built, looking at the 5 and 5, the 5 fundamentals of the characteristics, the 5 fundamentals that relate back to fireground considerations, and how to effectively identify methods and processes, both at the individual, meaning your level, the individual level, and then collectively at the organizational level, to develop and implement effective ongoing training within the context of the domain of building construction. In other words, the subject area of building construction needs to be integrated in your in-service training, into your monthly and annual drill and training schedule, whether you are a small rural organization, a common typical suburban organization, or a metropolitan suburban organization, all the way up to a metropolitan, an urbanized area on the career, combination, or volunteer side. Each one has very distinctive, ongoing, continuing requirements, both in terms of training, the in-service, the in-company training that, again, captain's drills and activities that can be implemented typically on a shift basis, or certainly on some periodicity on a drill basis within any organization. And then the formality of having in-service and formal drill and training programs, as well as special programs that specifically are associated with the subject area of building construction, that build upon previous offerings and presentations. And sometimes we talked about this on Tom Merrill's show on the volunteer firefighter, when we discussed some of the aspects that, again, our buildings are all over. They are protected by a variety of organizational structuring, large and small, simple to complex, from rural to the middle of nowhere to urbanized areas with high density capacities. And the one thing that sometimes we have to do is do a check and adjust, identify where we're at, what is it that we know, what is it, more importantly, that we don't know, identifying the gaps in the organization regarding the subject area of building construction, what's worked, what kind of things are working at the firefighter, the company officer, and the command level, and more importantly, identifying those gaps to identify opportunity to restructure, to rebuild, or sometimes just to fine-tune and increase the effectiveness of what you already have in place. But it's a varying scale. So again, sometimes we have to go back in order to go forward. Sometimes it's just a check and adjust. So we're certainly not indicating that everyone's programs are less than stellar. There are some exceptional programs that I've been privy to and witnessed and had an opportunity to review and discuss at the training level with organizations throughout the United States. And there's some exceptional things going on. But I also recognize through our continuing engagement with the National Fire Service, through our lecturing, seminar programs, and deliveries, that there is a significant gap that exists out there from metro to rural and everything in between, that relates back to knowledge, skills, and competencies and knowledge base. And unfortunately, I'll say this, it's much more than just stretching the line and going in. That's the simple part of the job. The rest of it that associates itself with, the first due arriving company officer and establishing the criteria, understanding and being able to put all of the elements together when we talk about first due size up at the company level, first due size up relative to the first arriving commanding officer. How does that relate back to the company level size up? Are we validating the assumptions that were being made? Are we on track? Is there something further, especially at the command level size up? And again, we've got our previous archive programs that got into some of the issues dealing with reading the building and so forth on size up factors and such. But and again, the third level is the incident commander, who now is transferring command as this incident may be unfolding and escalating in terms of complexity and demand and operations. Each one of those has very distinctive aspects of the size up that relate back to building performance, fire dynamics within that structure. One of the things that, again, in order to just provide some clarity in our conversation here, is that there are three fundamental aspects that we talk about when we talk about today's fire ground regarding our built environment. That relates back to the building, the compartment, and the company. So those three interrelated aspects dealing with understanding the building, understanding the compartment relative to fire dynamics, fire behavior, fire travel, and its relationship back to operational perspectives. And then ultimately, it's the capabilities and limitations of that company. And at least in this instance, it's the capabilities and limitations as they relate to knowledge, skills, and abilities. What are the criteria? What's the level of knowledge? What's the level of experience that combined together both formal and in the street types of training and experience levels that culminate, that give us the ability to operate at the task, at the tactical, and hopefully meet the objectives at the strategic level. The fireground influencing factors, again, of the built environment, building construction, and they directly influence fireground operations. When we talk about some of those influencers, again, of research, insight, and considerations, it all goes back to structural integrity, compartment performance, time considerations, and the firefighting impact from the task and operational level. It goes without saying, too, and I'll just make a quick note of this, not to belabor it, but again, when we take a look at yesterday's fireground and some of the aspects that continue to influence old school principles that conflict with the new sciences and the insights that we're getting from R&D in particular, and the improvements on methodologies and practices, much of what we can sort of focus in upon, and I think we talked a little bit about this in our episode number 2 of our series, but again, I don't want to too much overlap it, but really for the most part, buildings behaved, building construction and the aspects of the rules of engagement were pretty simple. Tactics were and direct engagement. They sort of fell into place regarding the fundamentals. So recognize that the building typing of our buildings has only existed, or I should say has existed since the early 1950s with the establishment of the NFPA 220 standard. Prior to that, our various regional and codes and standards utilized a different type of conflicting typing of buildings, and we can actually go back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the typing of buildings was far different than what we currently have today. But for what our purpose is today, again, we fundamentally utilize NFPA 220 for the typing of our structures, type 1 through type 5, and the associated codes that revolve around the classification, as well as the risking of our buildings in terms of how they will perform, and a variety of other codes and standards that relate back to building performance. And normally that is associated with both life safety performance elements as well as building performance. We talk about the resistiveness of that particular building and how it will relate back to our operation. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the challenges and demands. For many of us, when we talk about building construction and some of those related aspects from construction, I think that it's safe to say that there are typically a couple of key books that have been out there for a number of years and relating back to building construction. And I think it's safe to say that one of the most influencing books, certainly from my standpoint and for many of us, but again, here's the caveat. As I travel around, it's just interesting to note when I ask for a show of hands and I ask how many individuals in the audience, based upon the program, have had some formal training on building construction. And unfortunately, we constantly are seeing similar consistent results, and it becomes fewer and fewer. When I ask company officers in particular and commanding officers what type of formal training they have had beyond the fundamentals of recruit school, academy types of settings and so forth, or some of the types of trainings that one may have obtained through some of the traditional fire service seminars and trainings, whether it be FDIC, regional training, or special topic seminars that a variety of different individuals may be presenting, it continues to be of a lesser degree. In other words, we're not seeing consistencies that are out there. In 1971, November of 1971, Francis Brannigan, as he was referred to, or Frank Brannigan, wrote and published the Building Construction for the Fire Service. And building construction for the fire service has really been the Bible for training and really gave us that insights on how building construction has a direct relationship to our understanding and how it relates back all the way from the task, tactical, and operational level, but it has everything to do about what we're doing on the fireground. It was certainly the first fire service textbook specifically dedicated to building construction and also defined and influenced the fire service certainly for the next 20 years. And again, at the time in which Brannigan, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and actually throughout the late 70s and into the 1980s, Frank Brannigan was consistently out on the lecture circuit at all of the national conferences, continuing to present and give us insights on the various chapters of his book, along with his special seminars that both he and his wife would present all across the United States and certainly across North America. It's also interesting to note that it is not the first textbook specific to the aspects of the fire service. I'll throw this out again, too, that the first textbook for the fire service was published in 1932. And in that particular book, the Fire Chief's Handbook, that was published by the International Association of Fire Chiefs, that was the first defining book that was specifically published for the fire service, specific to the fire service, giving us insights on best practices throughout the United States that were culled from best practices in the mid to late 1920s. The book was first conceived in 1928, published in 1932, but again, it gave us insights on best practices to make the fire service better at a time in which there were no formal textbooks, there was no formality on best practices, to give us insights that led to the IFSTA Red Book series and a number of other books that we have. Again, I refer back to our other archive programs, but it's, again, you can understand that we've had a lot of programs over a lot of years here on fire engineering that have built upon a lot of the topical areas that we are talking about here today. So again, go back to it. We had some conversations about some details within those particular areas. And some of those aspects, again, in 1932, they first discussed talking about the typing of construction, the development of fire in each type of building that were prevalent and predominant at that time. And they talked about how each type of construction had its own characteristics and also had its own related aspects of challenges and risks and considerations when we talk about the continuing development of tactics in the early to late 1930s that were all built upon going into the 1940s and 50s. Into the 1960s, it was another significant period of time. The 60s and 70s brought forward a lot of very innovative concepts and books and such. Also at that time, although, again, when we talk about building construction, although Brannigan was not the first to talk about building construction, he was the first that brought it forward in a consolidated manner, meaning one specific textbook that merged and associated the different aspects of construction with fire protection engineering, some architecture, and some insights on construction as related to firefighting operations. So that was the premise of that book. But again, when we take a look at the other formative books that were key to the development of anyone in the fire service through the 1940s, 50s, throughout the era of the 1900s, the mid to late 1900s, and those were inclusive of the NFPA Fire Protection Handbook. Fire Protection Handbook continued to be the Bible of the fire service and eventually led to a separation with some additional insights with the Society of Fire Protection Engineers Handbook. But the NFPA Handbook, the NFPA Fire Protection Handbook, the Crosby, Fisk, Foster Handbooks of Fire Protection from 1914 through the 1940s. There were 5 to 9 different editions at that time frame, but it wasn't until the 1948 edition, the 10th edition of the Fire Protection Handbook in 1948, that some things become very consistent with the movement of building typing, the considerations of predictability performance, and again, some developing insights on construction features as they're related to the continuing trend of developing insights on a variety of emerging methodologies and practice. In other words, throughout the early 1900s, and especially when we got into the mid to late 1940s and 50s, construction was developing very significantly in a variety of different, everything from moving from the tenement and tenement types of structures to low-rise to high-rise structures, a movement of high-rise construction, steel construction, post-World War II. I mean, it just continued to trend all the way moving forward into what we consider the modern era of the fire service, as well as the modern era of building construction that primarily, in my opinion, and we have continued to advocate, is around the 1980s. Around the 1980 period was the defining point in which modern construction started moving forward as it relates back to what you all continues to give us insights on. But again, that is sort of the defining period of legacy, meaning everything prior to the 1980s, and then the modern era of construction, as well as all the subsets of that, are from the 1980s going forward. But again, please recognize that there are different layers and subsets, the era and vintage that we talk about within those particular standpoints. But if you have not picked up any of the fire protection handbooks, any of Frank Brannigan's previous editions, the first edition from 1971, all the way up through and including the current editions. The sixth edition was published in 2019. The first edition was inclusive of approximately 288 pages. The sixth edition in 2019, all the way up to 474 pages. And again, Frank Brannigan unfortunately passed away in 2006. And the current edition, which still continues to carry on his legacy of the Brannigan editions, again, is the involvement of Chief Glenn Corbett, who continues to promote and advocate and lead those publications and editions forward with both an expanding template, curriculum, outlines, and topical areas. But again, here's the rub, is that no one book is enough to address and cover all of the topics that are necessary in the area of building construction. That's part of the challenge. You've got to recognize that as a student of the job, and especially for those of you that are at the company and the command level, you've got to have multiple various editions of these textbooks because they all build upon themselves. One thing to make note is that for many years, the common template from the first through third editions, all the way up through into the early 1990s, they were pretty straightforward when we took a look at Brannigan's textbook. But the template of the books also led to a template for the curriculum. The curriculums that were developed in the 1990s and continue to be influenced by those currently were all based upon the subject area, talking about building types, and then building upon that from different types of occupancies. And more often than not, we talked about wood frame construction, we talked about fire resistive, non-combustible, steel construction, heavy timber, mill construction, semi-mill, and so forth. And then modern construction, primarily talking about engineered structural systems and so forth. That templated curriculum outline really has a tremendous degree of variations and focus areas, and especially currently, it continues to have a widening special topic and domain, but still continues to have a minimalistic approach to it. In other words, the topic of wood frame construction and the subsets in that area could fill an entire 500-page book by itself. Recognize that each topical area, when we talk about building or actually, when we do talk about building types, there are subsections to that one has to look at. So let's utilize wood frame construction as an example. Wood frame construction, although minimal relative to the topical areas that any one of the books that are out there, whether you talk about any book on building construction from a variety of different authors and publishers that are out there, they're minimal at best, due to the economics of book publishing. And again, we are typically seeing basic level insights on that topical area. But wood frame construction can have everything from heavy timber construction that's associated with a different type of what we call heritage construction from the 1800s, and how that type of construction leads and goes to balloon framing, to actually goes from heavy timber to brace framing to balloon framing to a variety of platform framing, the introduction of engineered systems. When we talk about the variety of things that were associated with the 1980s and 90s, and here we are in the 2000s, and we're seeing a whole variety of different typing of the new type 4 construction that's not so associated with what was commonly heavy timber construction from the late early 1900s, but a new classification of heavy timber or mass timber construction that revolves around podium construction and a whole different type of building typing, occupancy risks, occupancy usages, and associated risks in terms of understanding fire dynamics, fire travel. More importantly, how do I put these things together when I'm confronted with a fire in a building that has limited exposure to the fire service regarding its inherent construction features, the uniqueness of construction sciences that went into the building of that particular building, of which we know we do not have best practices that have yet to be identified due to the newness of these structures. So we are continuing to see these aspects. The one influencing factor that came about that defined the curriculum template for our training, and again continues to influence much of what we see in textbooks, what we see within the training manuals, and certainly within the certification process, and that was the National Fire Academy's FESHI Building Construction Curriculum Template. And that template came about in 1998, and that continually has influenced the manner in which the textbooks are being written, because the approved template for, especially when we talk about 2- and 4-year college programs, was the template to follow relative to the outlining. Books were being written against that template that defined how the book curriculum would be laid out, and there was very little deviation from that, because again, the FESHI approved templates was what they were looking at, consistency for both the academic, especially the 2- and 4-year college programs, to provide consistency in what and how fire personnel were being trained, but also created a very limiting artificial challenge in terms of the modeling and the advancements and how to push and pull and sometimes open up the barriers that were being established by the FESHI curriculum template. And that is part of the challenges. I think one of the things that I personally am looking at trying to move forward is a different perspective on how to capture succinct, timely information that again is relevant back to what we've constantly been seeing with training aspects, but also to allow a timeliness of periodic updates in a manner that is cost effective from a textbook standpoint that can be published and brought forward for the fire service, but it's also manageable in terms of the sound bites and the information, so that's not overwhelming, and that's part of the challenge. We take a look at the widening special topical areas, the domains. It has to be much more than a minimalistic approach to it, with an increase integration of tactical operation-based considerations, and that's part of the challenge. We have to be looking at the built environment, architectural engineering, fire protection, and tie that back into tactical issues at the company and the command level. And each one of those has some different characteristics and so forth from it. When we take a look at curriculums, again, they are certainly adverse. We've got to go beyond the aspect of simplification. We've got to be able to expand and take a look at the highly technical aspects of those. But unfortunately, really nobody really cares. There's a degree of complacency that's out there. Don't confuse me. I want to stretch the line and go in. Don't confuse me. Here's the 18 to 20 occupancy types. Here's the 5 fundamental building types. We know a little bit about building construction. I can get somebody to hopefully give me some insights on what balloon frame is versus an engineered structural systems, but it constantly falls back on the basic premises. It's the fundamentals. But I'll say this is that, again, we're also seeing these widening gaps. We've been advocating and presenting programs on Type 3 construction, our Main Street series, for a number of years, talking about Main Street Type 3 construction, brick and joist, ordinary construction, as well as Type 4 heavy timber, mill, semi-mill construction, because, again, that used to be a common conversation point. It also used to be a common presentation that we saw in the 80s and 90s. But again, I would say this: when was the last time you actually sat through a full day program on Type 3 and Type 4 construction? And it was something much more than just a fundamental approach on here's Type 3, here's brick and joist construction, that really got into the details. Again, historical precedences. There are very key areas of construction features in which certain types of features, that principles and methodologies that went into the buildings, but no one is getting into that level of detail. And unfortunately, I'll say this, is that we are also seeing very inaccurate information that's being presented, and normally that falls back on something that the presenter read, either anecdotally or empirically, when we talk about being read and applied from something from a reading standpoint. But sometimes I also hear a lot of the negativity of what someone is presenting that's only based upon their experience, a little bit of knowledge that they've gotten from some textbook. Most of it is in the field. It's anecdotal. The stuff that we hear constantly are influenced by, which is good in many instances, but sometimes it's the anecdotal things that keep getting passed down over and over again, and that anecdotal, inaccurate information that constantly is challenged by the facts versus the anecdotal things that we think are factual and are applied to operations each and every day, the jobs that are out there, when in fact they are very inaccurate and many times maybe, again, resulting in less than appropriate operations in the fireground, resulting in a lot of luck versus understanding things and being able to operate with associated with them on the operation. Today's challenges relate back to training competencies, skill sets, knowledge, baseline for officers, commanders, and incident command officers and managers. There needs to be a baseline of knowledge, especially assuming the positions at the company and at the command level. And one of the things that we continue to advocate is a modular approach that is built upon specific domains, functional areas that are able to be expanded and aligned to the technical challenges based upon those construction, then also integrating operations to tactical levels of tactics, risk, safety, and integrating those into the next level when we talk about decision-making processes. So, those are some of the elements there that are very, very critical. One of the first and simplest things when we take a look at how do I develop the appropriate level of training? So we've talked about some things that relate back to just the relationship of the fact that the built environment really is very dependent upon understanding various professional disciplines. When we talk about architectural engineering, building sciences, fire protection engineering, there's constantly a very rapidly evolving set of standards that are going, or a set of conditions that are affecting the building sciences in particular that are coming out of architecture and engineering. And again, there's a critical interdependency that they relate back to them. There are some specifics when we talk about the relationship. So one of the things that the best way, so here's a simple question. If I was to ask the question, is the study of building construction an easy study? Is it an easy read? And normally the reply back to is no, and sometimes very emphatically with a very, very high level of reply is that it's very difficult at best, right? And again, it's once and done. And I read a couple of chapters in Brannigan's book or the IFSTA manual or many other of the textbooks that are out there that have delved into the topical conversations. And again, whether it's Dunn's book, Chief Vinnie Dunn has put out a number of exceptional books back in the 80s and 90s. If you go back into some of the archives of what he's published out. But again, the collapse of burning buildings and what has now evolved into with Brannigan's, with Chief Dunn's series of the battle space. There are 4 specific books that are out there that I would highly encourage you to take a look at, as well as some things that are drawn out of the most current as well as older editions of the NFPA Fire Protection Handbook. One of the things I want to make reference to when we talk about some training, that every single one of you can at least go back to a baseline. And again, it's there may be some issues that are outdated, and I talk about the template that is influencing our conversation here out of the FESHI template that comes out of the NFA and so forth. But again, with the National Fire Academy being one of our significant leaders in developing curriculums and providing consistencies for the fire service in a variety of different curriculum areas. The NFA does have a self-study program that I've made reference to a couple of times. And again, I want to really hone in on this right now, is that there is a self-study guide or self-study program that is available on the NFA's curriculum web pages. It's a 6-hour program. It's called the Principles of Building Construction. The course code is Q 0751. And again, it's a 6-hour self-study, self-paced program dealing with the principles of protected and non-protected and non-combustible construction, masonry construction, heavy timber, and wood framing. This is consistent with the old building construction series that came out of the NFA that I was very proud to be a part of back in the 1980s and early 1990s. I actually worked with Frank Brannigan on some program development at the NFA in that time frame that put out 2 12-hour programs that had been in place right up through here through the early 2000s and now have been replaced by the self-study guide of principles of building construction, although the other 2 programs are still available, but they are outdated. There are some things in there that fall again on that template that are limiting at best. But again, I would encourage you to take a look at that opportunity for personal growth and development. I would also encourage you to take a look at one defining book, and that is Francis Ching, Ching, Building Construction Illustrated. That book has a number of different editions that have come out over the number of years, actually going back almost 50 years. My first edition that I obtained when I was going to school to become an architect back in 1975, 1976. That first edition that I obtained is still on my shelf here in my home library, and as well as all of the other 5 to 6 editions that have come out from that standpoint. But it is a great accompaniment. So whether you are utilizing the NFPA Fire Protection Handbook, whether you're utilizing the IFSTA Building Construction book, whether you're using any one of the Brannigan's book or other books that are out there that get into size up, whether it be Turpak's book, whether it be Jimmy Smith's book on building construction, whether it be what am I thinking of here? Some of the other books, Chief John Norman's book on the Company Officer's Handbook for Fire Tactics. Again, many of our tactics books get into some conversation on construction, not nearly enough, but recognize that every single one of those books builds out your library for personal growth. And that being said, too, for any of you that are in the training officers positions that are responsible for developing drills, whether it be at the company officer level for in-service, whether it be at the drill level for drill presentations and training at the departmental level, or in service at the academy levels for larger organizations or multi-jurisdictional organizations, you've got to be privy to and have access to these books. There's a variety of information that's available online, but certainly you've got to have had the ability to read into them. Don't rely on liberally obtaining someone else's book or PowerPoint program and just throwing that up. That becomes part of the problem. The challenge is that we continue to see less than adequate information that's being presented out there. It's far easier to throw up a PowerPoint program that may be outdated, but why spend the effort, right? It's easier to throw that up. Don't have to worry about doing the research, getting into a variety of different books and developing some insights and so forth on things that might be directly applicable to your department, your first due, your community that may not have relevancy based upon what might be in the PowerPoint program. So again, if you're talking about low rise and high rise and have none, that's obviously a problem. If you have a variety of heavy timbered and type 3 buildings of ordinary heavy timber, semi-mill construction, and they've gone through an adaptive process of reconstruction and now have gone from an old factory or manufacturing building and now are multiple occupancy or mixed use types of structures, you need to have an understanding of both the old construction methodologies, principles, and practices, as well as an understanding and appreciation of the new construction that's gone into that new building that still acts like an old building, but again, may have a variety of different construction features that are in there. One of the main factors, again, when we take a look at the development of this model, and this goes back to our conversation in both episode 1 and episode 2 of our series, is that to develop an appropriate and well-balanced training program, stop looking and relating that back to the FESHI template, stop and go well beyond the basic building construction types. We talk about type 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. One of the things that we've provided and advocated for and continue to stress and present to the both the international, the North American, and the American Fire Service is the fundamentals of all buildings can be related back to 5 key domains. And that relates to the building anatomy of the structure, and that also is inclusive of the era and vintage of that building. It is the occupancy type, occupancy risk, and occupancy characteristics of that particular building. So think this in mind as I go through these 5 pieces. So take into account, let's say, a building of wood frame construction relative to the balloon frame structures, both from the early 1900s all the way to possibly the post World War II era, from the 1900s, maybe early 1900s, the 1920s, all the way to the early 1950s before we went into the platform frame construction and modern era. So with that wood frame construction, so understanding the anatomy, era and vintage. It's understanding the occupancy type, occupancy use, and considerations and factors. It's understanding the collapse and compromise characteristics of that particular building. It's also understanding the methods and the materials of construction that went into that era and vintage of that building. So if it was built in the 20s and it was built in the 50s, it was built in the 80s, there are very specific methods and materials of construction that are associated with that building. And then the 5th piece of that is having a comprehension and getting into the level of understanding from a training standpoint of the fire dynamics of the building. Again, when we talk about the structural fire ground, it has everything to do with how will fire affect that particular building of a certain era and vintage, with particular anatomy. And again, how does it relate back to those 5 fundamental pieces? That becomes part of the template from a training standpoint. And then secondly, the other part of the 5 and 5 is there are 5 key factors of that building when we talk about the roof systems, talk about perimeter walls, we talk about the compartment or the floors of the building. The compartment relates back to the individual or a series of compartments in that building, or the floor areas, again, how they're connected, singular or multiple, but it's the roof system, perimeter walls, it's the compartment, it's understanding the floor and or ceiling systems, and then lastly, it's understanding the absence or presence of voids that may be in the building. Those 5 and 5 give us that template to take a look at those particular things. I would venture to say this, there's 2 elements here to think about when we're developing training. We've got to be thinking about individual training, the things that you can do individually to help develop and promote and move you forward as you assume other positions of responsibility that are well beyond what is being offered at the departmental level or at the regional level. So there's self-development that one can obtain through readings, and also through attaining participation and going out and going to local regional conferences, and going certainly out to national conferences such as FDIC. It's also safe to say that many of our community colleges throughout the United States have a tremendous opportunity, if you're not looking to attain or obtain either a certification or a degree at the 2 or 4 year level, certainly consider taking a class, again, and this is a minimum. I don't care if you're at the volunteer or at the career level. At a minimum, you should have a concentrated college level class that's associated with the fundamentals of building construction, of which other classes are going to build upon that. But a solid semester class on building construction it's a demand, and it's a requirement. It's a minimum requirement on today's fire ground. So I would really have you consider some of those opportunities. I also would certainly be remiss if I didn't say that we've got some things in the works here to provide sort of other opportunities for some online programming that we've got plans for that are going to be coming out here hopefully in the fall, that will provide some ongoing curriculum and some cohorts programs here that will be announced and made available through our online footprint, through our social media pages and so forth, that may provide many of you with just taking a series of online classes that we'll be offering over the course of a number of weeks to help start building out. And a couple of the topics that we're going to have is we're going to have a Main Street series that's going to cover 4 weeks, again, a single topic for a given period of time, both daytime, nighttime, and weekend opportunities. But a 4 to 6 week program just on Main Street, ordinary brick and joist construction. We're looking at a 4-week program on mega mansions. We're looking at a 4-week program or 4 series of offerings dealing with engineered structural systems, another one dealing with podium construction, and so forth. So some things that are out there. If you are at the training officer level and are responsible for developing training, either at the battalion, the divisional level, the in-service training at the academy level, or are just responsible for developing drills in your department, stop and take a look at what's the frequency in which you are talking specifically about building construction. And again, going beyond just the 5 fundamentals, going beyond occupancy types, going beyond the things that we all have gotten for many, many years. We've got to be building upon that. Don't get me wrong, but you've got to be able to spend an hour every couple of shifts, or certainly something more than just 3 hours a year, if that's all you're doing on building construction. And again, it's safe to say that 3 hours or 4 hours a quarter is bare bone minimum. And what we're suggesting that as a baseline, you've got to have at least, anywhere from a minimum of 12 to 24 hours of minimal training on building construction. And again, for those of you that are on the volunteer side, that's a challenge at best when there's so many other things to look at. But again, you've got to consider alternate drill night training opportunities, special topic drills that are being offered, and other things that can build upon the much needed domain of building construction as relates to structural firefighting. So again, I would encourage you to take a look at what you are offering. For those of you that are looking for some suggested templates, feel free to send me an email. I'll send you out some things that are aligning with both the NFPA 1700 standard, the 1700 guide that came out, how that relates back to some considerations, some things that align with both the NFPA 1700, 1561, 1710, 1720, some things that align with our first arriving construction tactics and safety, and some things that align with this conversation of how can I take a topical area, have a basis relative to what all of the other textbooks and certification manuals have out there to them, but start thinking about that 5 and 5, thinking about anatomy, taking a look at occupancy, collapse and compromise characteristics, methods and materials of construction, and fire dynamics associated with the roof system, the perimeter walls, the compartment, floor and or ceiling systems, and the voids that are present, and relate that back to fire dynamics within the building. Those are certainly topical areas to start considering. Again, think about presenting those at least each quarter in some standpoint, taking a look at skill sets that are building upon what you already have. And again, if you're in line, you've got some very good training that has been offered over the last couple of years, then build upon that. It's really not the fact that you've got to go back to step one and rebuild, but certainly consider what I've suggested here with the 5 and 5. Take a look at some common threads, themes, and topics that are specific to your first due, to your battalions, to your jurisdictional areas of your city. Your mutual aid response areas certainly should be something to consider. So when we talk about environmental risks, again, the training must be commensurate with both current and future fire department, community built environmental risk. In other words, what are the current levels of risk, but also what's coming down the road. Even here in my own community, in our mutual aid response area, which is just outside of our first due, we have a multi-billion-dollar chip plant, a computer chip plant manufacturing facility that's going to dramatically change our entire region, our entire community, multiple county areas, especially the location of this particular complex. It will require a significant change in the composition and makeup of the fire service organizations that provide both first, second, third due related responses, but it's also going to impact a multiple county area due to the proximity to the county line in which that complex, as it develops and grows out, which will have a sizable campus, sizable buildings that are just going to completely change and the composition and makeup of this entire region. So again, training must be commensurate with both current and future fire department, community, both environmental risks. And again, don't forget about the training that's going to be needed. You might be pretty good about what you've got in terms of your response area, but think about mutual aid, especially if you've got a mutual aid to a neighboring community that might be a bit of a run and so forth. Don't neglect some of the things that might be in their first due as a mutual aid responding organization that may not be in yours, that does require of you to have a different level of training. Always consider going beyond the generality. Be sensitive to inaccuracies that individuals in your organization may not have the level of training. Bring in an outside individual to monitor and do a check and adjust, to be able to take a look at the quality level, the accuracy level of your personnel. Sometimes we don't see the forest from the trees. You may have some individuals that are presenting information that may be inaccurate based upon their limited experience level. So the other aspect too might be to consider bringing in an outside guest speaker from a larger organization within the region that you can make use of in terms of that level of expertise. Sometimes, again, bringing in a career individual into the volunteer setting within the locale, within the region, or certainly within the state setting, or even consider bringing in an outside resource from a national level to provide sometimes not only just individual presentations at a seminar basis, but also possibly even a larger full day session or a multiple day session. But again, you've got to take a look at those particular aspects. Relate that back to size up, start thinking about the levels of details. Again, think about the minimum level of training and just challenge yourselves that you've got to be able to go forward with that. Don't, and again, part of the challenge is disregard the fact that it's too technical. You have the ability to go forward. It's just small bites at a time. Take a look at what can be developed. If you've got to go back to the 5 fundamentals, take a look at the 5 building types and start expanding upon that. But look at the levels of risk. Is it in multiple occupancies? Is it the multiple occupancy garden apartments that were built in the 60s and 70s or 80s that are part of your major challenges? Is it the new construction? Is it the old construction? Is it the vacants? Is it the vacant industrial complexes? So whatever the issues are, take a look at those high-level risks relative to the risk of both fire propagation going beyond the confines of the building of origin, how will they affect the integrity of the community. Take a look at occupancy risk relative to those that are living, working within those particular structures. And again, the things that you may need to know to better prepare yourself for that operation to be more effective and more efficient to that standpoint. Build that into your schedules. And again, build upon it from a technical standpoint. Think about developing and going out and taking your own photographs, as well as utilizing what's available online to develop your programs. Try to make it more specific, and it does take time. It does take effort. Reach out to your community colleges for some of the professors and instructors that are presenting there to provide some assistance. Reach out at the state and certainly at the national level. There are numerous individuals, including myself, that are more than happy to provide some assistance to you to help develop and move your training forward from that standpoint. Think about common themes that can build upon previous programs that you did in a previous quarter or at some other point from last year. So there certainly is a will and a way. Think about classroom-related activities, and certainly that takes me to one of the things that is certainly near and dear to me when I talk about some of these aspects, and that's getting out into the streets, reading your buildings. So again, it's a formality of a classroom presentation, classroom setting. It's also taking the classroom out into the streets, as I always say, and do your walking tours. One of the common themes in sort of our premier programs, and we've been doing this for a number of years now, is taking the classroom into the streets with our Reading the Buildings program. So you can also do the same thing, and that's really the genesis. Much of what we talk about here today all started at the local level. Take and get your companies out there, whether they be a small level or multiple companies, and go out and take a look at one particular building that's under construction. And again, do your homework, talk to the building officials, get some insights so that you're accurate and appropriate to what you're looking at when you are lecturing, and be able to present accurate, technical information there within the built environment of what's being built under construction, as well as going into areas that are being renovated, buildings that are being renovated in your main streets, either standalones or complex structures. Work with the officials that are building the job sites. Talk to the foreman, talk to the superintendents, talk to the architects, talk to your building officials. Go out and get some insights from your building inspectors and your buildings department. They have a wealth of information, your plan reviewers, who can fill in the gaps, have the conversation. They are more than happy and more than willing to provide some technical assistance to help fill in the gap at the individual level or in terms of developing the training programs for your department. Reach out to the architects and the engineers that are out there. Stop in and ask about some information that you may not be able to obtain. There are many books that have yet to be written on some of the evolving topical areas that are out there, revolve around, let's say, podium construction, for example, as well as the evolving aspects of engineer construction. So there's so many things that are occurring. That's why I say the built environment is developing at such a fast pace with so many unique challenges and risks that we just don't know what it is that we need to know because we don't know it. And that is part of the challenges and part of the problems that are out there. So there's a lot of professionals, the engineers, the architects, the building officials, the code enforcement areas, plan reviewers, other individuals and other organizations that have more sizable training academies that have already done some of the homework. So again, although I said you shouldn't be just taking something and applying it generically to your organization. That's a simple way to do it. When we talk about some of the CAN programs, take the CAN program and build upon that with local level insights from building photographs, from local level fires and insights historically, timely that have occurred in the past. Take a look at the line of duty desk. Take a look at the NIOSH report, after action reports. Get the insights, the lessons and learnings, the graphics, the information that are in there. Tie them into your programs. So it's safe to say that, again, we have just scratched the surface on this topical area. There are numerous references and books that are out there that'll help you. I would say pick out whatever building construction book you feel comfortable with and delve into it and read it a number of times. That's first and foremost. It's not once and done. I would encourage any of you at all levels, large or small, from an organizational standpoint, invest the time. If you can't afford the most current editions, seek out previous editions of the NFPA Fire Protection Handbook. If you're able to get an older copy of the SFPE, the Society of Fire Protection Engineers Handbook on Fire Protection Engineering, those two go hand in hand. Any editions of Brannigan's book, the ISTA manuals, any of the other technical, tactical books that are out there, all of these are going to be part of a larger integrated perspective of integrating tactics, operations, along with building construction. Again, it's safe to say that Francis Ching's Building Construction for the Fire Service, Francis Ching Building Construction Illustrated is going to be a phenomenal read. You can obtain that online through a variety of different resources. Older editions are available at a very, very inexpensive rate, but also consider getting some of the most current editions that get into some of the more timely and relevant building construction issues that are currently affecting us. But again, recommendations on books, variety of different resources that are out there, a lot of great stuff that's online. Get out, photograph your buildings that are being renovated, photograph the buildings that are being built and under construction, seek out information online, develop yourself individually at the individual level to make yourself better, to be part of a more effective system that you are part of at the firefighter, at the company officer, the command, at the organizational level, administratively or operationally. If you have any level of responsibility for training, truly examine where your training schedules are, what are the topics that are you're presenting, and if there's a gap. If you are not talking about building construction, at least for a minimum of 60 minutes once a quarter, I'm telling you, that is a gap. You've got to be able to find the time to, again, impart upon your companies. And again, this is also reflective upon and is associated with the frequency of demand, the kinds of structures that you have in your first due, the density level, the complexity of your operations, frequency of working fires. I mean, there's a lot of other facets in there to balance out the level of training that's necessary in terms of hours. But you've got to be committing at least a couple of hours of time in the functional area of the curriculum of building construction so that you are able to perform adequately and safely with a balance of risk that's out there based upon the type of construction, the types of occupancies, and the types of fires that we are encountering, large or small. So again, consider the field activities. If you have an opportunity, again, I don't want to make this a commercial, but again, we do provide nationally our Reading the Buildings training programs. We can certainly bring that program as well as our building construction programs to your locale at a departmental, a regional basis for multiple organization or individual department needs and so forth. So reach out to us, and certainly there's a variety of things that we can do for you if there's some challenges in making that happen. We are out on the road across the United States with a variety of different training programs that we are presenting at the state, regional, and at the conference levels. We certainly look forward to seeing you take a look at our content in our archives here on fire engineering for our various other programs and start building your degree of literacy. There is both building and fire literacy that gets into this topical area. And hopefully our three-part series have given you some insights. If there is some additional information that you're looking to obtain, feel free to reach out to me through our online social media. Our email address is available, as well as our cell phone number, my cell phone number. Feel free to reach out to me, and we can do a one-on-one FaceTime or do a one-on-one Zoom program and talk about what your needs are and so forth. So we've got a lot of exciting programs coming up here, especially as we're coming out of the summer in another month or a month and a half here. But this fall is shaping up to be a phenomenal series of programs across the United States, as well as what we're going to be offering here on fireengineering.com with some of the things that we are continuing to work forward to. We've been talking and sort of alluding to those a couple of times over with our ambitious schedules and so forth. So keep an eye out for those. We really hope to make those a reality, along with some additional writings and some other things that we are looking forward to bring forward to you, our listeners that are part of this phenomenal profession, the American or international, North American, the North American Fire Service. There's nothing better than that. But again, recognize, figure out where your gaps are, what you're doing well, what you're doing that needs to be improved upon. If you are doing some exceptionally good things, share those with other organizations in your community, your mutual aid networks within your region to continue to move that forward and just build upon that. So again, some really good things that we can do on a variety of levels. So just checking to see if there's some other things that we need to discuss here, but there are not. I think we've covered them all. Again, it's safe to say that, again, you've got to go beyond the minimum fire service standards, the firefighter 1001 and 1021. You've got to develop your training for company officer, mid-level commanders, as well as the incident commanders. You've got to be able to have appropriate training that's commensurate with your fireground roles and responsibilities, and that training has to align with the complexities of your fire department response area, your first due, and your jurisdictions from that particular standpoint. So all good stuff. So until next time, companies are in quarters or are off the air. Stay safe, but keep in mind there's a job being worked somewhere in the streets, in your city, across the country, and around the world, doing what we do best and being who we are, and that's firefighters. So thanks for tuning in to this edition of Buildings on Fire, taking you to the streets. We've got a whole new series of programs that we're going to be rolling out here, another couple of multi-part series that we'll be rolling out in September. Stay tuned for our announcement of what we'll be talking about in our August series here that, again, will be, I think, very interesting for all of you. So, again, stay safe, keep on learning, and we look forward to talking to you next time on Buildings on Fires, taking it to the streets.
This episode of Fire Engineering Podcast is sponsored by LogRX, providing real-time accountability of all your narcotics from cradle to grave. Coming soon, LogRX will also track medical supplies, equipment, PPE, and even vehicle checks. Learn a better way to track your narcotics at logrx.com. That's LOGRX.com.
Like a trusted turnout jacket you've had for years, Flex 7 outer shell fabric delivers a perfectly broken-in feel on the very first wear. Flexible, comfortable, and powered with the strength of Enforce technology, Flex 7 outer shell fabric is made to move. To learn more, visit tencatafabrics.com/flex7. Flex 7, powered by Enforce technology, only from TenCate Protective Fabrics.